Today we're going to talk about Hundreds of People. This is book 2, chapter 6. In this chapter, we are in Soho, which is in London. So you can see this image all the way to the left. This is a modern image of what Soho looks like. At the time that this book is set, Soho would have been on the very edges of London, sort of out in the country. Lucy is being sought after by 3 different men. Well, 2 really. All the way to the right is what I imagine Mr. Stryver looking like. And then in the center is Charles Darnay. And on the left is Sydney Carton. Remember that Charles Darnay and Sydney Carton look a lot alike. So I just had those images there to kind of suggest what they might look like in your mind's eye. What we're going to start paying attention to is this archetypal imagery of footsteps. So we talked about how they appear in To Kill a Mockingbird, again in The Wizard of Oz, and even in Harry Potter. So let's take a peek at what we're paying attention to. In this chapter, we start with a conversation between Miss Pross and Mr. Lorry. Miss Pross is concerned because she thinks that there are hundreds of men pursuing Lucy, and the only person who's actually worthy of her precious Lucy is her brother Solomon. But what we realize and what Mr. Lorry knows is that Solomon is actually a scoundrel, and he stole Miss Pross's money years ago and disappeared with it. And then the 2 of them have a conversation about how Dr. Manette can't seem to get rid of his shoemaker's bench. And they're worried that that reminds him of a time that isn't healthy for him, his time in imprisonment. Okay, so a few things that we learn about characters include Solomon Pross. We don't meet him, but Miss Pross tells us about him. And though she loves him unfailingly, we, as we read, understand that he's actually kind of a jerk. But we realize that Miss Pross is a remarkably loyal and loving woman, even though she's kind of rough around the edges. So she's really delightful. And Mr. Lorry loves her. He thinks she's just delightful. We learn a little bit more about Charles Darnay, we learn a little bit more about Sydney Carton, and there are going to be 2 dominant motifs that we're going to pay attention to: footsteps and storms. Okay, so let's decide what our focus is going to be. We're going to have a couple different places we're going to focus. First of all, we want to watch for the way that Sydney Carton feels about Lucy, and whether or not Lucy realizes that. The second thing we want to pay attention to are 2 episodes that appear in this part of the text. One is Darnay talking about when he was imprisoned. So we've seen him go through this trial. He'd been tried for treason, and now he's describing an episode that happens while he was in prison. And then the second thing I want you to pay attention to is the storm at the end of the chapter and how that is symbolic of what's going to come. All right, so let's start with the very beginning. This is the second book, the 6th chapter, called Hundreds of People. The quiet lodgings of Dr. Manette were in a quiet street corner not far from Soho Square. On the afternoon of a certain fine Sunday, when the waves of 4 months had roiled over the trial for treason and carried it, as to the public interest and memory, far out to sea, Mr. Jarvis Lorry walked along the sunny streets from Clerkenwell, where he lived, on his way to dine with the doctor. After several relapses into business absorption, Mr. Lorry had become the doctor's friend, and the quiet street corner was the sunny part of his life. On this certain fine Sunday, Mr. Lorry walked towards Soho early in the afternoon for 3 reasons of habit. Firstly, because on fine Sundays he often walked out before dinner with the doctor and Lucy. Secondly, because on unfavorable Sundays, he was accustomed to be with them as the family friend, talking, reading, looking out of window, and generally getting through the day. Thirdly, because he happened to have his own little shrewd doubts to solve, he knew how the ways of the doctor's household pointed to that time as a likely time for solving them. A quainter corner than the corner where the doctor lived was not to be found in London. There was no way through it, and the front doors of the doctor's lodging commanded a pleasant little vista of street that had a congenial air of retirement on it. There were few buildings then north of the Oxford Road, and forest trees flourished and wildflowers grew and the hawthorn blossomed in the now vanished fields. As a consequence, country air circulated in Soho with vigorous freedom instead of languishing into the parish like stray paupers without a settlement, and there was many a good south wall not far off on which the peaches ripened in their season. Here is the description that I was talking about at the beginning of the chapter, that Soho was on the edge of the city, so it's still a little bit country-like. The summer light struck into the corner brilliantly in the earlier part of the day, but when the streets grew hot, the corner was in shadow, though not in shadow so remote but that you could see beyond it into a glare of brightness. It was a cool spot, staid but cheerful, a wonderful place for echoes, and a very harbor from the raging streets. There ought to have been a tranquil bark in such an anchorage, and there was. That sentence might be hard to understand. Essentially, Dickens is comparing this little street corner to a harbor. A bark is a boat or ship. So he's suggesting that here in this port, there is a peaceful little boat or house. And that's the doctor's house. So here we go. There ought to have been a tranquil bark in such an anchorage, and there was. The doctor occupied 2 floors of a large, stiff house where several callings purported to be pursued by day, but whereof little was audible any day, and was shunned by all of them at night. So he lives in a quiet little building. There are shops in the building, but no one ever goes there, and they close early, so it's a really quiet place. In a building at the back, attainable by a courtyard where a plane tree rustled its green leaves, church organs claimed to be made and silver to be chased, and likewise gold to be beaten by some mysterious giant who had a golden arm sticking out of the wall of the front hall, as if he had beaten himself precious and menaced a similar conversion of all visitors. So basically, that's a hard sentence also. Essentially, he's describing what all the businesses are. There's a goldsmith there, a church organ maker, a silversmith, but nobody ever goes to these shops, so you never see them. All you see is the sign, and the sign for the goldsmith shop is a golden arm sticking out of the wall. Very little of these trades, or of a lonely lodger rumored to live upstairs, or of a dim coach trimming maker asserted to have a counting house below, was ever heard or seen. Occasionally a stray workman putting his coat on traversed the hall, or a stranger peered about there, or a distant clink was heard across the courtyard, or a thump from the golden giant. These, however, were the only exceptions required to prove the rule that the sparrows in the plane tree behind the house and the echoes in the corner before it had their own way from Sunday morning on to Saturday night. Dr. Manette received such patience here as his old reputation, and its revival in the floating whispers of his story, brought him. So this tells us that Dr. Manette is now practicing medicine again, and people have heard the story of his imprisonment in the Bastille. His scientific knowledge and his vigilance and skill in conducting ingenious experiments brought him otherwise into moderate request, and he earned as much as he wanted. These things were within Mr. Jarvis Lorry's knowledge, thoughts, and notice when he rang the doorbell of the tranquil house in the corner on the fine Sunday afternoon. Dr. Manette at home? Expected home? Miss Lucy at home? Expected home? Miss Pross at home? Possibly at home, but it was certainly impossible for a handmaid to anticipate intentions of Miss Pross as to admission or denial of the fact. As I am at home myself, said Mr. Lorry, I'll go upstairs. Although the doctor's daughter had known nothing of her country of her birth, she appeared to have innately derived from it that ability to make much of little means, which is one of the most useful and most agreeable characteristics. Simple as the furniture was, it was set off by so many little adornments of no value but for their taste and fancy that its effect was delightful. The disposition of everything in the rooms, from the largest object to the least, the arrangement of colors, the elegant variety and contrast obtained by thrift in trifles, by delicate hands, clear eyes, and a good sense, were at once so pleasant in themselves and so expressive of their originator, that as Mr. Lorry stood looking about him, the very chairs and tables seemed to ask him, with something of that peculiar expression which he knew so well by this time, whether he approved. In other words, the house is beautifully decorated. There were 3 rooms on a floor, and the doors by which they communicated being put open that the air might pass freely through them all, Mr. Lorry, smilingly observant of that fanciful resemblance which he detected all around him, walked from one to another. The first was the best room, and in it were Lucy's birds and flowers and books and desk and work table and box of watercolors. The second was the doctor's consulting room, also used as a dining room. The third, changingly speckled by the rustle of the plane tree in the yard, was the doctor's bedroom, and there, in a corner, stood the disused shoemaker's bench and tray of tools, much as it had stood on the 5th floor of the dismal house by the wine shop in the suburb of Saint Antoine in Paris. And we're going to pause here for part 1.